The fork trembled in Michael Thompson's hand as he stared at the untouched prime rib growing cold on his plate. Christmas Eve at the Heritage Table, the same restaurant where his parents had their first date 40 years ago. Now they were gone, and he sat alone in his wheelchair, surrounded by families celebrating while he counted pills in his jacket pocket. Through the frost-etched window, a figure appeared, blonde hair escaping from a tattered military jacket, breath visible in the December cold. She pressed her palm against the glass, blue eyes locking onto his with desperate intensity. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear through the barrier. "Give me the leftovers, and I'll teach you how to walk." Michael's bitter laughter died in his throat. Something in those eyes, not pity, not charity, but absolute certainty, made his heart skip. The woman's gaze never wavered, even as restaurant patrons began to stare. 2 minutes. That's all it took for everything to change. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millbrook, Tennessee had always been the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. Population 15,000, nestled in the Cumberland foothills, it was a town that prided itself on Sunday services, high school football, and taking care of its own. But the pandemic had changed things. Empty storefronts lined Main Street like missing teeth, and the factory closures had left too many good people with nowhere to go. Michael Thompson's mansion sat on Elm Ridge like a monument to isolation. Built with tech money earned in Nashville before the crash, it was supposed to be a gift for his parents. The place where they'd finally retire and watch grandchildren play in the sprawling yard. Instead, it became a mausoleum. The car accident 18 months ago had taken more than his legs. It had taken his purpose, his connections, his will to live. The wheelchair wasn't just transportation, it was his excuse to hide from a world that expected him to be the golden boy who had it all figured out. Grace Elizabeth Sullivan carried her father's legacy in more ways than one. Sergeant William Sullivan had died in Afghanistan when she was 19, leaving behind Purple Heart citations and medical textbooks that Grace treasured like scripture. Her mother's cancer battle had drained their savings and left Grace with nothing but memories and her father's oversized military jacket. 3 months ago, the eviction notice had been the final blow. Now she lived in an abandoned trailer behind the Walmart, surviving on whatever kindness strangers could spare. The Heritage Table represented everything Grace couldn't afford: white tablecloths, prime rib dinners, families with enough money to celebrate. But hunger had a way of stripping away pride. She'd been watching through the window for 20 minutes, working up the courage to ask for scraps, when she saw him, the man in the wheelchair, staring at his untouched meal, like it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Something in his posture reminded her of her father's patients, wounded warriors who'd forgotten how to fight. Her nursing aid training kicked in before her common sense could stop her. This wasn't about food anymore. This was about two broken people recognizing something in each other that the rest of the world had given up seeing. The distance between the sidewalk and that window felt like crossing a battlefield. But Grace pressed her palm against the cold glass anyway. The hostess at the Heritage Table had seen plenty of desperate people over the years, but something about the blonde woman's determination made her pause. When Michael Thompson, the reclusive millionaire who tipped better than he talked, wheeled himself to the entrance and asked her to let the woman in, she didn't argue. Money talked, even when it whispered. Grace's hands shook as she stepped inside, not from the cold, but from the weight of crossing an invisible line. The warmth hit her first, then the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat that made her stomach clench with need. Every eye in the restaurant followed her progress as she walked to Michael's table, her father's oversized jacket hanging loose on her small frame, boots leaving melted snow on the pristine floor. "Sit," Michael said, his voice rusty from months of minimal conversation. Up close, Grace could see the gray threading through his dark hair, the expensive watch on a wrist that was too thin, the way his hands gripped the wheelchair arms like anchors. "Tell me what you meant out there." Grace pulled out the chair across from him, hyper-aware of the whispered conversations at nearby tables. "Your legs aren't paralyzed," she said quietly, cutting straight to the heart of it. "I can see it in how you hold yourself, how you shift weight. Your body knows how to walk. Your mind just forgot how to let it." Michael's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Lady, I've spent more money on specialists than most people see in a lifetime. They all say the same thing. Physically, there's nothing wrong. But that doesn't change the fact that I haven't walked since the accident." "Tell me about the accident." Grace's voice carried the gentle authority she'd learned from watching her father work with traumatized soldiers. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush. "The icy December night, 18 months ago, driving home from the office after discovering his business partner, Robert Sterling, had been embezzling funds. The decision to confront Sterling the next morning. Then the black ice, the loss of control, the sickening moment when the car left the road and rolled 3 times into the ravine. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later," Michael continued, his knuckles white as he gripped his water glass. "Doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Bruised ribs, concussion, but my spine was fine, except I couldn't feel my legs, couldn't move them. Every test came back normal, but they might as well have been gone." Grace nodded, recognizing the pattern from her father's case files. "Conversion disorder," she said softly. "Your mind protecting you the only way it knew how. If you can't walk, you can't face what you need to face." "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means you never confronted Robert Sterling about the money, did you? Never pursued charges. The accident gave you an excuse to let it go, to retreat from everything that required you to stand up and fight." Michael's face flushed red. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're some homeless woman who probably read a psychology article online." "My father was Dr. William Sullivan," Grace interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Army psychiatrist, specialized in trauma cases. I grew up listening to him help soldiers who couldn't walk after IED explosions, who couldn't hold a rifle after losing their squads. I worked as a nurse's aide until the hospital downsized 6 months ago. I know what broken looks like, Michael. And I know what healed looks like, too." The restaurant had grown quieter around them, conversations dying as people strained to hear this unlikely exchange. Michael stared at Grace for a long moment, seeing past the worn jacket and tired eyes to something that made his chest tight with recognition. "So, what are you proposing exactly?" he asked finally. Grace glanced at his untouched plate. "Feed me. Give me somewhere warm to sleep, and let me show you what my father taught me about helping people remember who they used to be. And if it doesn't work, then you'll have done something good for someone who needed it. When's the last time you did that?" The question hit harder than Grace had intended. Michael looked around the restaurant, at the family celebrating, at the waitstaff rushing to serve others, at the warm light that couldn't quite reach the cold places inside him. "There's a guest house behind my place," he heard himself say. "It's small, but it's furnished. You can stay there for a week. But I don't want any mystical healing nonsense or false hope. If you're going to help me, I want to know exactly what you're doing and why." Grace's smile was the first genuine thing Michael had seen in months. "Deal. But first, I really do need you to give me those leftovers. I haven't eaten since yesterday." As Michael pushed his plate across the table, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. For the first time since the accident, he wanted to see what tomorrow might bring. The guest house behind Michael's mansion was larger than any place Grace had called home in months. Single bedroom, kitchenette, and a bathroom with hot water that ran clear, luxuries she'd almost forgotten existed. But as she stood in the doorway that first night, clutching her father's medical textbooks and the few possessions that fit in her backpack, the space felt overwhelming rather than welcoming. She'd slept on the hardwood floor, unable to bring herself to use the bed. Old habits from the trailer, where the mattress had been too moldy to trust. When Michael's assistant James Mitchell arrived the next morning with fresh groceries and barely concealed suspicion, he found Grace making coffee on the floor beside a stack of psychiatric journals. "Mr. Thompson wants to see you at the main house," James said, his tone professional but wary. He was a compact man in his 40s, graying at the temples with the careful posture of someone who'd spent years managing other people's problems. "He's in his study." Grace followed him across the manicured lawn, noting how James positioned himself between her and any valuable outdoor fixtures. The main house was all glass and steel, designed to showcase wealth rather than provide warmth. Inside, Michael sat behind an enormous desk surrounded by medical files and legal documents. "I've been reading about conversion disorder," he said without preamble. "Also known as functional neurological symptom disorder. Genuine neurological symptoms without an identifiable medical cause. The mind essentially lying to the body." Grace settled into the chair across from him, noting the defensive set of his shoulders. "Your mind isn't lying, Michael. It's protecting you. There's a difference." "From what? From walking? That doesn't make sense." "From whatever walking represents to you." "Independence? Confrontation? Moving forward when part of you wants to stay hidden?" Grace leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about Robert Sterling." Michael's hands stilled on the papers. "He was my business partner. We built the company together from nothing. Software solutions for small businesses. I handled the technical side. He managed operations and finances." "And you trusted him?" "Completely. Rob was—" Michael paused, his jaw working. "He was like a brother. We grew up here in Millbrook, went to high school together. His family didn't have much, and mine helped pay for his college. When we started the company, I gave him equal shares because I believed we were building something together." Grace watched the micro-expressions cross his face, the tightening around his eyes, the way his voice changed when he said Sterling's name. "What did you find that night?" 3 months of fabricated invoices, phantom employees on the payroll, client payments being rerouted to accounts I'd never seen. Rob had been systematically bleeding the company dry for over a year. Michael's voice hardened. "The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing how long he'd been lying to my face. How many conversations we'd had where he must have been laughing at me inside." "So you decided to confront him the next morning." "I was going to drive to his house, demand an explanation, maybe give him a chance to make it right before I called the authorities." Michael laughed bitterly. "Stupid, right? Even after finding proof he was stealing from me, I still wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding." Grace pulled one of her father's journals from her bag, flipping to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "My father treated a soldier who lost the use of his legs after his unit was ambushed. Physically, there was nothing wrong with him. But every time he tried to walk, his body would shut down. Turns out the ambush happened because his best friend, someone he trusted completely, had been feeding information to insurgents for money." Michael's breath caught. "What happened to him?" "He couldn't walk, because walking meant potentially trusting again. Potentially being betrayed again. His mind decided that staying still was safer than moving forward into a world where the people you love might hurt you." The study fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on the mantel. Michael stared out the window at the garden where his mother had planned to grow tomatoes, where children were supposed to play someday. "The accident," he said finally. "I keep having the same dream about it. The car starts to slide, and I see Rob's face in the rearview mirror. Not because he's actually there, but because I'm thinking about him when I lose control. Like somehow, even when he wasn't present, he was still destroying my life." Grace nodded. Trauma has a way of tangling everything together. The betrayal, the accident, the fear, your mind connected them all into one big threat. And the only way it knew to keep you safe was to make sure you couldn't get hurt again. By making me unable to chase after people who might betray me. By making you unable to chase after anyone at all. James appeared in the doorway with lunch, soup and sandwiches arranged on expensive china. He set the tray down with the careful movements of someone who'd been watching their employer retreat from life for 18 months. "Sir," James said carefully, "Dr. Hayes called. She wants to schedule another session." "Cancel it," Michael said automatically, then caught Grace's expression. "What? When's the last time you left this house?" Michael and James exchanged glances. "The grocery store? Maybe 6 months ago," James answered when Michael remained silent. "And before that? Medical appointments? Physical therapy that didn't work? Legal meetings that went nowhere?" Michael's voice grew defensive. "There's nothing out there I need to see." Grace stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked downtown Millbrook. "See that church steeple? That's where my parents got married. And that building with the blue awning? That used to be Sullivan's Hardware, my grandfather's store. He built it with his own hands after coming back from World War II. Grace, this town raised you, Michael. These people knew you before you had money, before you had a company to steal from, before you had a wheelchair to hide behind. But you've been sitting in this house for 18 months, convinced that the whole world is dangerous because one person betrayed you." Michael felt something crack open in his chest, painful but necessary. "I don't know how to trust my own judgment anymore. If I was so wrong about Rob, how can I trust myself about anything else?" Grace turned from the window, her blue eyes bright with understanding. "That's why you need to start small. Trust me for 1 week. Let me show you what your father's techniques can do. Not because I'm asking you to trust the whole world again, but because sometimes healing happens one person at a time." James cleared his throat. "Sir, I should mention, Robert Sterling called this morning. He wants to meet with you about resolving things amicably. I told him you weren't available." Michael's hands clenched into fists, and Grace saw something flicker in his legs, a subtle shift that he didn't seem to notice. "He's still in town?" Michael asked. "Never left. Still living in the same house, still running what's left of the business operations?" Grace filed that information away, recognizing the anger that had sparked movement in Michael's lower body. Anger could be useful if channeled correctly. "1 week," she said, extending her hand toward him. "Let me try." Michael looked at her hand for a long moment, then reached out and shook it. "1 week. But I want to understand every technique you use. No mysteries, no false hope." "Fair enough. But Michael, this isn't about false hope. This is about remembering that you're stronger than what broke you." The first 3 days established a routine that felt foreign to both of them. Grace arrived at the main house each morning at 8, carrying her father's leather satchel and a thermos of coffee that she'd learned to make strong enough to cut through Michael's natural skepticism. They worked in his study, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of his isolation, medical reports, business documents, and legal files that hadn't been touched since the accident. Grace's approach was methodical, grounded in the techniques she'd absorbed from years of listening to her father work with traumatized soldiers. She started with basic exercises designed to rebuild the connection between mind and body, guided breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, visualization techniques that her father had called mental physical therapy. "Close your eyes," she instructed on the 3rd morning, settling into the chair beside his desk. "I want you to imagine you're walking through this house. Not remember walking, imagine it. Feel your feet on the hardwood floors in the hallway. Feel the texture of the carpet in the living room." Michael's face scrunched with concentration. "This feels ridiculous. Your brain doesn't know the difference between imagined movement and real movement." The neural pathways are the same. We're teaching your mind to remember what it feels like to trust your body. For 20 minutes, Grace guided him through imaginary walks around his property, to the garden, down to the pond, through rooms he hadn't entered since returning from the hospital. She watched his face carefully, noting when his breathing changed, when tension crept into his shoulders, when some internal resistance kicked in. "There," she said softly when his jaw tightened. "What just happened?" "I was walking toward the front door in my head, and suddenly I couldn't anymore, like hitting a wall." "The front door leads outside. Outside means facing the world again. Your mind is still protecting you from that." Grace made a note in her father's journal. "We'll work up to it." James hovered at the edges of these sessions, bringing meals and coffee with the protective air of a man watching his employer engage in something that might be either healing or heartbreak. On the fourth day, he pulled Grace aside as she was leaving. "He's different," James said quietly. "More alert. He actually asked me to order groceries yesterday instead of just nodding when I suggested it. But Miss Sullivan, Grace, I need you to know something about Mr. Thompson's situation." They stood in the garden where Michael's mother had planned to grow vegetables, surrounded by raised beds that had never been planted. The autumn air carried the smell of wood smoke from neighboring houses. "Robert Sterling has been calling every few days since you arrived," James continued. "Never leaves a message, but the timing isn't coincidental. Word travels fast in a town this size." "People are talking about the woman living in Mr. Thompson's guest house." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What kind of talking?" "Some of it's harmless gossip. But Sterling has friends on the town council, people who owe him favors. He's been asking questions about your background, your legal status. I think he's worried that Mr. Thompson is getting stronger. Because if Michael recovers, he might pursue charges for the embezzlement. More than that, Sterling never stopped bleeding the company. With Mr. Thompson incapacitated, he's had free rein to liquidate assets, move money around. If Michael suddenly becomes functional again..." James left the implication hanging. That evening, Grace found herself unable to concentrate on her father's journals. She walked the perimeter of the guest house, thinking about patterns of predation, about how abusers often escalated when their victims showed signs of independence. Her father had seen it with soldiers who tried to report commanding officers for misconduct, the retaliation swift and vicious. The next morning, she changed tactics. "We're going outside today," she announced when she arrived at the main house. Michael, who had been making steady progress with the visualization exercises, went rigid. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I know you don't. That's exactly why we're doing it." Grace moved to his wheelchair, unlocking the brakes. "Trust is a muscle, Michael. It atrophies when you don't use it. You've been trusting me in this controlled environment for 4 days. Time to test that trust in the real world." "Grace, I can't..." "You can't what? Feel your legs, or you can't handle people seeing you outside this house?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Michael's hands gripped the wheelchair arms, knuckles white with tension. "What if someone sees me and asks questions? What if I run into Rob?" "Then we'll deal with it together." Grace knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his eye level. "Michael, your father used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling the fear and moving forward anyway. Right now, your fear is bigger than your world. Let's start changing that." They began with the garden. Grace pushed his wheelchair along the stone paths his mother had designed, talking about the plants that would bloom in spring, the vegetables that could grow in the raised beds. Michael's breathing was shallow, hyper-alert to every sound from the neighboring properties. "Mrs. Henderson is watching us from her kitchen window," he muttered. "Wave at her." "Grace?" "Wave at her, Michael. She's been your neighbor for 15 years. She brought casseroles after your accident. The least you can do is acknowledge her existence." Reluctantly, Michael raised his hand. Mrs. Henderson waved back enthusiastically, then disappeared from the window only to emerge on her back porch. "Michael Thompson, is that you out there?" she called across the fence. "I haven't seen you in ages. And who's this lovely young lady?" Grace felt Michael's entire body tense, but she placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "That's Grace Sullivan," he called back, his voice stronger than she'd expected. "She's helping me with some therapy." "Well, it's about time. You tell that assistant of yours I've got fresh apple pie if you want some real food for once." As Mrs. Henderson went back inside, Michael exhaled slowly. "That wasn't so bad." "Baby steps," Grace agreed. "Tomorrow we'll try the end of the driveway." But tomorrow brought Robert Sterling. Grace saw the black BMW first, pulling through the main gate with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he belonged there. She was in the garden with Michael, working on an exercise where he practiced shifting his weight in the wheelchair, small movements that were rebuilding the neural pathways between his brain and his lower body. "Michael." Sterling's voice carried across the yard before Grace could warn him. "Finally decided to get some fresh air?" Robert Sterling was exactly what Grace had expected, and somehow worse. Tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He approached with the casual authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, but Grace noticed the way his gaze lingered on her, calculating and cold. "Rob." Michael's voice was carefully neutral, but Grace felt the tremor that ran through his body. "What are you doing here? Can an old friend stop by to check on your recovery? I heard through the grapevine that you've been making progress. That's wonderful news." Sterling's eyes shifted to Grace. "And you must be the miracle worker everyone's talking about. Grace Sullivan, isn't it?" The way he said her name made Grace's skin crawl. This wasn't a casual introduction. He knew exactly who she was. "Mr. Sterling," she replied evenly. "I did some research after hearing about your arrangement with Michael. Interesting background. Daughter of Dr. William Sullivan, the Army psychiatrist. Lost your job at Millbrook General 6 months ago. Evicted from your apartment in September." Sterling's smile widened. "Quite a coincidence, you showing up just when Michael needed help." Michael's hands clenched into fists. "What's your point, Rob?" "No point at all, just making conversation. Though I do find it fascinating how some people seem to gravitate toward opportunities. A homeless woman convincing a wealthy, vulnerable man that she can cure him. It's almost like something out of a con artist's playbook." Grace felt Michael's anger building like a storm front, and with it something else, a subtle shift in his posture, the way his legs seemed to respond to his emotional state. She'd seen it before in her father's patients, trauma responses that bypassed conscious thought. "You need to leave," Michael said, his voice low and dangerous. "Actually, I need to discuss some business matters with you. There are documents that require your signature, decisions about the company's future that can't wait indefinitely. I've been patient, Michael, but at some point we need to move forward." Sterling's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "Unless, of course, you're planning to resume active involvement in the business, in which case we'd need to have some very different conversations." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Grace saw Michael's face go pale as the implications sank in. Recovery meant confrontation. Confrontation meant facing what Sterling had done, what he was still doing. The psychological trap was perfect. Get better and face potential retaliation, or stay sick and let the theft continue. "I think this conversation is over," Grace said, moving to stand beside Michael's chair. Sterling's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating. "Miss Sullivan, I don't think you understand the complexities of the situation here. Michael and I have history, business relationships, legal obligations. This isn't something an outsider can simply fix with amateur therapy sessions." "Then maybe it's time for some professional help," Grace replied. "I think the authorities would be very interested in reviewing those business documents you mentioned." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Sterling looked between them, recalculating, and Grace realized they'd just crossed a line there was no going back from. "Well," Sterling said finally, his pleasant mask sliding back into place, "I can see you've been filling Michael's head with all sorts of ideas. That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve things quietly, for old time's sake." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Grace, you might want to be careful walking around town after dark. A woman in your situation, well, people might get the wrong idea about your intentions here." After Sterling's car disappeared down the driveway, Michael and Grace sat in silence for several minutes. Grace watched him process what had just happened, the threat implicit in Sterling's words, the realization that his recovery posed a danger not just to himself but to her. "I can't do this," Michael said finally. "I can't put you at risk because of my problems." Grace knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Michael, listen to me. Your father didn't raise you to hide from bullies. Your parents didn't sacrifice to give you opportunities so you could let someone like Sterling win. And I didn't survive losing everything just to walk away when things get difficult. But if something happens to you, then we'll face it together. But I'm not leaving, and you're not giving up. Not when we're this close to getting your life back." Michael stared at her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of his mother, the stubborn determination that had built a life from nothing, that had refused to let circumstances define possibilities. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want to try standing up." The attempt came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Sterling's visit. Grace had spent the night in the main house at Michael's insistence. He'd been having nightmares about Sterling returning, about threats made in shadows. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking glass. The guest house was engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking at the winter sky. Grace's first thought was relief that she hadn't been inside. Her second was horror as she realized everything she owned: her father's medical journals, the few photographs of her parents, the jacket that still smelled like him, was burning. Michael appeared beside her in his wheelchair, James behind him with a phone pressed to his ear, calling the fire department. But Grace could see in Michael's face that they all knew this wasn't an accident. "The journals," she whispered, watching 20 years of her father's work turn to ash. "All his research, his case studies." Michael reached for her hand. "Grace, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. Sterling's sending a message." The fire department arrived within minutes, but the guest house was already a total loss. As firefighters worked to contain the blaze and prevent it from spreading, Sheriff Tom Bradley approached with his notebook out and questions that felt like accusations. "Miss Sullivan, any idea how this might have started? Space heater malfunction, electrical issues, maybe a cigarette that wasn't properly extinguished?" Grace bristled at the implication. "I don't smoke, and I wasn't even sleeping there last night." "Right, you were in the main house, with Mr. Thompson." Sheriff Bradley's tone was carefully neutral, but Grace caught the judgment underneath. "Can anyone verify that?" "James can," Michael said sharply. "And I can." "And what exactly are you implying, Tom?" Bradley had known Michael since high school, had watched him build his business and retreat after the accident. Now he looked uncomfortable but determined. "I'm not implying anything, Mike, just asking questions. But I've got to tell you, there's been talk around town about your arrangement. With Miss Sullivan here, some folks are concerned." "What kind of talk?" Grace asked, though she suspected she knew. Talk about a homeless woman taking advantage of a vulnerable man. Talk about how convenient it is that you showed up just when Mr. Thompson was at his lowest point. Robert Sterling's been pretty vocal about his concerns for his old friend's welfare. Michael's hands clenched into fists, and Grace saw it again. That subtle movement in his legs, the body responding to emotion even when the conscious mind said it couldn't. Sterling's the one you should be investigating, not Grace. Now, why would you say that? The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace could see Michael calculating, weighing the cost of honesty against the potential consequences. She made the decision for him. Because he's been embezzling from their company for over a year, she said. Michael has documentation, financial records, forged invoices, phantom employees. Sterling's been bleeding the business dry while Michael was recovering. Sheriff Bradley's expression shifted from skepticism to interest. That's a serious accusation, Miss Sullivan. You have proof of this? Michael hesitated. Tom, it's complicated. The company structure, the way the finances were handled. It's not complicated at all, Grace interrupted. Sterling's been stealing, and now he's trying to intimidate Michael into staying quiet. This fire isn't an accident. It's a warning. Well, now, that's quite a theory, but unless you have actual evidence of arson. Check the electrical system, Grace said. Check for accelerants. Do your job instead of listening to gossip. Bradley's face reddened. Miss Sullivan, I don't appreciate your tone, and I think you need to consider whether your presence here might be making things worse for everyone involved. After the sheriff left, Grace and Michael sat in his study, watching through the window as firefighters finished their work. The guest house was a blackened shell, steam rising from the wreckage where water met hot metal and ash. I have to leave, Grace said quietly. Sterling's escalating because I'm here. If I go, maybe he'll back off. Absolutely not. Michael's voice was firm. Running away won't solve this. It'll just prove that intimidation works. Michael, I've lost everything. My father's research, his journals, the last pieces of my family history. I can't lose you too. Something in her voice made Michael look at her more closely. Tears were streaming down her face, not the dramatic sobbing of grief, but the quiet devastation of someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. Grace, he reached for her hand. You haven't lost me. And we're going to make Sterling pay for what he's done. But first I need to tell you something. Michael wheeled closer to her chair, close enough that she could see the determination building in his eyes. Yesterday morning, when you were making coffee, I tried something. I tried to stand up. Grace's breath caught. What happened? I made it about halfway before the fear kicked in, but for just a moment I felt my legs, really felt them. Not just sensation, but strength. Michael's voice grew stronger. Sterling can burn down buildings, threaten us, try to destroy evidence, but he can't take away what you've given me back. And I'm not going to let him take you away either. The next morning brought Dr. Patricia Hayes, Michael's psychiatrist, along with James and a man Grace didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Grace Sullivan, the stranger said, extending his hand. I'm David Morrison, attorney for the Thompson family. James called me about your situation. Grace shook his hand warily. What situation? The fact that you're being targeted for helping my client, the fact that someone committed arson to intimidate you, the fact that Sheriff Bradley seems more interested in victim blaming than investigating actual crimes. Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting for justice. I understand you've lost some important documents in the fire. My father's medical journals, 20 years of research on trauma therapy, PTSD treatment, conversion disorders. It was all I had left of him. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. Grace, I've been working with Michael for over a year, and I've seen more progress in the past week than in all our previous sessions combined. What you're doing, It's not standard therapy, but it's effective. Your father's techniques could help a lot of people. Could help, past tense. They're gone now. Morrison cleared his throat. Actually, they're not. I've been in contact with the Veterans Administration. Your father's research was significant enough that copies of his work are archived at Walter Reed Medical Center. His techniques have been used successfully in treating combat-related conversion disorders. We can get you copies of everything. Grace felt something break open in her chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. Everything? Everything. Case studies, methodology, treatment protocols. It's all there. Morrison's expression grew serious. But there's something else. The VA records show that your father treated a patient named Robert Sterling in 2019. Traumatic brain injury with associated psychological issues. The treatment was unsuccessful. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Grace's mind raced through possibilities, connecting dots she hadn't seen before. What kind of psychological issues, Doctor? Hayes consulted her own notes. According to the VA files, Sterling exhibited symptoms of paranoid ideation, impulse control problems, and what your father described as pathological opportunism. The brain injury seemed to have damaged his capacity for empathy and long-term planning. So when Michael discovered the embezzlement, Grace said slowly, Sterling wasn't capable of the kind of rational response a healthy person might have. He couldn't calculate consequences or consider alternatives. He could only react with immediate aggression. Michael's face had gone pale. The accident. Rob knew my route home from the office. He knew I always took Mountain Road when it was late. If he followed me, if he waited for the right moment on that icy curve. We can't prove premeditation, Morrison cautioned, but we can prove the embezzlement. And with the pattern of escalating behavior since Grace arrived, we can build a case for ongoing harassment and intimidation. Doctor. Hayes stood up, moving to look out the window where the guest house used to be. There's something else you all need to understand. Sterling isn't going to stop. Brain injuries like his often result in fixation behaviors. He's become obsessed with maintaining control over the situation, and that obsession will only intensify as Michael recovers. So what do we do? Grace asked. Morrison opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of legal documents. We fight back. Michael, you're going to file formal charges for embezzlement. Grace, you're going to help me document every instance of harassment and intimidation, and we're all going to work together to make sure Sterling faces consequences for what he's done. Michael looked at Grace, then at the legal papers that represented his choice between safety and justice. For the first time since the accident, the decision felt clear. Let's do it, he said. But Grace, I need you to know, this might get worse before it gets better. Sterling's going to fight back, and he's going to target you specifically because he knows you're helping me get stronger. Grace thought about her father, about the soldiers he'd helped find their way back from trauma, about the courage it took to face your fears instead of hiding from them. Then we'd better make sure I'm not an easy target. She stood up from her chair and moved behind Michael's wheelchair. Come on, it's time for your real physical therapy to begin. If we're going to war with Sterling, you're going to need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. For the first time in weeks, Michael smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression he'd worn since the accident, but the genuine grin that had built a business and won hearts. Yes, ma'am. Let's see what these legs can really do. As Grace pushed his wheelchair toward the door, both of them felt the same electric anticipation. The game was changing, the stakes were rising, and for the first time since their unlikely partnership began, they were moving forward together instead of just surviving separately. The breakthrough came 3 days later, but it arrived wrapped in disaster. Michael had been making steady progress with Grace's physical therapy regimen. Each morning, they worked on weight-bearing exercises, balance training, and what Grace called trust falls, controlled movements designed to rebuild his confidence in his body's ability to support him. His legs were responding, muscle memory slowly overriding psychological barriers, but the process was fragile, dependent on Grace's constant encouragement and the safety of their controlled environment. That safety shattered at 2:17 a.m. when Sterling struck again. Grace woke in the main house guest room to the sound of shattering glass downstairs. Her first instinct was fire, Sterling's preferred method of intimidation, but there was no smell of smoke, no orange glow creeping under her door. Instead, she heard voices, multiple people moving through the house with purpose. She grabbed her phone and crept to the door, texting James, who lived in the apartment above the garage. "Intruders in main house. Call police." Then she made her way toward Michael's room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Michael's bedroom door was ajar, and through the crack she could see Sterling standing beside the bed where Michael lay unconscious. Two other men flanked him, faces she didn't recognize, but their body language screamed hired muscle. One held a syringe, the other a stack of legal documents. "The sedative will keep him under for about 6 hours, Sterling was saying quietly. "Long enough to get his signature on the transfer papers and move the remaining assets offshore. By the time he wakes up, it'll be too late to reverse anything." Grace's blood turned to ice. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was outright theft, accomplished through what amounted to medical assault. She pulled out her phone to call 911, but Sterling's voice stopped her. "What about the woman?" "What about her?" one of the men replied. "She's seen too much, knows too much, and she's been filling Michael's head with ideas about fighting back. We can't leave loose ends." Grace realized they were talking about killing her. Sterling's brain injury hadn't just damaged his impulse control, it had erased his ability to recognize lines he couldn't cross. In his mind, eliminating problems had become as simple as signing a business document. She had two choices: run and hope to reach help before they finished with Michael, or try to stop them herself. Grace thought about her father, about the soldiers he'd treated who'd faced impossible odds with nothing but courage and training. She thought about Michael, unconscious and helpless, about to lose everything he'd worked to rebuild. Grace chose to fight. She moved back to the guest room, grabbing the baseball bat she'd noticed in the closet, probably left over from Michael's high school days. Then she returned to his bedroom door, took a deep breath, and burst through. "Get away from him!" The three men spun toward her, Sterling's face cycling through surprise, anger, and cold calculation. "Miss Sullivan, how convenient that you're here. It saves us the trouble of tracking you down. I've already called the police. They're on their way." Sterling smiled, the expression chilling in its complete lack of warmth. "No, you haven't. We cut the phone lines and installed a cell signal jammer 20 minutes ago. No one's coming to help you." Grace raised the bat, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Maybe not. But I'm not going to stand here and watch you drug and rob an unconscious man." "You're right," Sterling said, nodding to his companions. "You're not going to stand there. Dave, take care of her." The larger of the two men moved toward Grace with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this before. Grace had never been in a real fight in her life, but desperation and 18 months of watching her father's PTSD videos had taught her something about survival instincts. She swung the bat with everything she had. The crack of wood connecting with the man's forearm was sickeningly loud. He screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his arm. Grace didn't wait to see how badly she'd hurt him. She spun toward the second man, who was reaching into his jacket for what she suspected was a weapon. "Michael!" she shouted, hoping the sound might penetrate whatever Sterling had given him. "Michael, wake up!" The second man's gun cleared his jacket just as Grace heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the wail of police sirens growing louder. James had gotten her message and called for help before the signal jammer went active. Sterling's face went white. You said you handled the phone lines. We did. This is impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was small-town neighbors looking out for each other, security systems that connected to monitoring stations outside the jamming radius, and a loyal assistant who'd learned to expect trouble and plan accordingly. The man with the gun hesitated, looking between Grace and the approaching sirens. That moment of uncertainty was all Grace needed. She dove across the room, landing hard beside Michael's bed and shaking him with desperate intensity. "Michael, please, you have to wake up. They're trying to steal everything." Sterling lunged toward her, but the bedroom door burst open and Sheriff Bradley appeared with his weapon drawn, followed by 2 deputies. For a moment, Grace thought they were saved. Then she saw the expression on Bradley's face, not relief, but irritation. "What the hell is going on here?" Bradley demanded, but his gun was pointed at Grace, not at Sterling. "Thank God you're here, Tom," Sterling said smoothly, his panic disappearing behind practiced sincerity. "I came to check on Michael and found this woman attacking him. She was hitting him with that baseball bat, screaming about money and contracts. I think she's having some kind of breakdown." Grace stared in horror as she realized what was happening. "No! They drugged him. Sterling has a syringe and legal documents. They were trying to forge his signature." "She's been under tremendous stress," Sterling continued, his voice full of manufactured concern. "Living as a homeless person, dealing with the fire at the guest house, I think she's finally snapped." Sheriff Bradley looked between them, his weapon still trained on Grace. "Miss Sullivan, put down the bat and step away from Mr. Thompson." "Tom, please, you have to listen to me. Check Michael's pulse, check his pupils. They gave him something to keep him unconscious while they stole his business." "I said put down the bat!" Grace's hands shook as she lowered the baseball bat to the floor. Around her, Sterling's accomplices were quietly backing toward the window they'd entered through, taking advantage of Bradley's focus on her. "Sheriff," Grace tried again, "those men are getting away. They broke into this house. They assaulted Michael." "What men?" Bradley looked around the room, but Sterling's companions had vanished into the night. Only Sterling remained, playing the role of concerned friend to perfection. "There were 2 other men with syringes and guns," Grace insisted, but even to her own ears it sounded like the ramblings of someone in crisis. Sterling shook his head sadly. "Tom, I think she's hallucinating. The stress of her situation, the trauma from the fire. She needs professional help." Michael stirred on the bed, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, Grace felt a surge of hope. He would tell them what had happened, would confirm her story. But when Michael tried to speak, his words were slurred, incoherent, the after-effects of whatever Sterling had given him, making him appear intoxicated rather than drugged. "Sir?" Bradley approached the bed. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell me what happened here?" Michael's eyes struggled to focus. He looked at Grace, at Sterling, at the sheriff, but couldn't seem to process what he was seeing. "Grace, why is everyone—" "He's been drinking," Sterling said quietly. "I've been worried about him. Depression, pain medication, now alcohol. I think Miss Sullivan has been enabling his destructive behaviors instead of helping him heal." Grace watched in devastation as her credibility crumbled. Michael couldn't defend her in his current state. The physical evidence, broken glass, the syringe, the legal documents, had disappeared with Sterling's accomplices. It was her word against that of a respected businessman, and she was a homeless woman who'd been living off his charity. "Miss Sullivan," Sheriff Bradley said, "I'm placing you under arrest for breaking and entering, assault, and disturbing the peace. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Grace looked back at Michael, trying to communicate everything she couldn't say aloud. Sterling stood beside his bed like a protective friend, but Grace could see the cold satisfaction in his eyes. The last thing she heard as they led her from the room was Sterling's voice, soft and sympathetic. "Don't worry, Michael. I'll take care of everything while you're recovering. You just focus on getting better." The Millbrook County Jail hadn't been designed for long-term housing, but Grace had been there for 3 days when the truth finally began to surface. Her cell was a concrete box with a narrow window that showed nothing but the parking lot where Sterling's BMW came and went at regular intervals. He was playing the role of concerned friend, visiting Michael daily while ensuring Grace remained isolated and discredited. Grace's phone call had gone to David Morrison, the attorney, but even he seemed shaken by the charges against her. "Grace, I believe you, but the evidence is problematic. No witnesses except Sterling, no physical proof of the other men, and Michael's testimony is compromised by whatever drug they gave him." "What about the syringe? The legal documents?" "Gone. Sterling claims he never saw them. Says you were having a breakdown and attacked him when he tried to calm you down." Morrison's voice carried the frustration of a man accustomed to winning cases with facts, not faith. "I'm working on bail, but Sheriff Bradley is claiming you're a flight risk." Grace hung up the phone, feeling more alone than she had since her parents died. Through the small window of the visitation room, she could see Sterling's car in the parking lot. He was probably visiting Michael right now, consolidating his control while his victim remained confused and vulnerable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. James Mitchell arrived at the jail on Thursday afternoon, his usually composed demeanor cracked with urgency. He'd managed to convince Sheriff Bradley to let him see Grace by claiming he needed to retrieve something she'd left at the house. "Miss Sullivan," he said quietly, glancing around the visitation room to ensure they weren't overheard. "I need you to know that Mr. Thompson is asking for you constantly. The medication is wearing off, and he remembers more each day. He knows something happened that night, and he doesn't believe Sterling's version of events." Grace felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced since her arrest. "Is he okay? Are they giving him more drugs?" "Sterling's been trying, but I've been watching everything that goes into Mr. Thompson's body. I may just be an assistant, but I've been with him for 8 years. I know when someone's trying to manipulate him." James leaned forward. "There's something else. Mrs. Henderson from next door saw everything." Grace's breath caught. "The neighbor?" "She was up with her sick cat Tuesday night, looking out her window when she saw men climbing through Mr. Thompson's bedroom window. She didn't call the police immediately because she thought it might be some kind of medical emergency. She saw them carrying what looked like medical equipment." James pulled out his phone, showing Grace a photograph. "She took this picture. The image was grainy, taken through a window in low light, but it clearly showed 2 men Grace didn't recognize climbing out of Michael's bedroom window. One was carrying a small black bag, the other clutching his arm in obvious pain. She didn't come forward earlier because Sterling convinced her that you'd been the intruder, that the police had everything under control. But yesterday she saw Sterling at the grocery store, and something about his behavior made her suspicious. She started asking questions around town." Grace studied the photograph, recognizing the man holding his injured arm, the one she'd hit with the baseball bat. "This proves there were other people there that night." "It gets better. Mrs. Henderson has a security camera system her son installed last year. The cameras captured everything: Sterling's car arriving, the other men, them leaving after the police showed up. She's been going through the footage with her son, and they found something else." James showed Grace another image on his phone, this one clearer. It showed Sterling near his car, handing what appeared to be a syringe to one of the men. This proves Sterling was lying about not seeing any medical equipment. He was part of whatever they were doing to Mr. Thompson. Grace felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Why didn't she come forward sooner? She's an elderly woman who trusted the word of the sheriff and a man she's known for years. But Mrs. Henderson also knew your parents, Grace. She remembers your father treating her husband's PTSD after Vietnam. She couldn't reconcile the daughter of Dr. Sullivan with the violent criminal Sterling was describing. The vindication should have felt sweeter, but Grace was consumed with worry about Michael. "How is he really? Sterling hasn't hurt him?" James's expression darkened. "Mr. Thompson is getting stronger every day, which is making Sterling increasingly desperate. Yesterday he brought legal papers for Michael to sign, something about emergency business decisions. When Mr. Thompson refused, Sterling became aggressive." "What kind of aggressive?" "He grabbed Mr. Thompson's wheelchair, shook him, started shouting about ingratitude and betrayal. That's when I knew we were running out of time. Sterling's mental state is deteriorating rapidly." Grace thought about the brain injury Dr. Hayes had mentioned, about how trauma could manifest in escalating violence when the person felt cornered. "James, you have to get Michael somewhere safe. Sterling isn't going to stop until he has complete control, and if Michael keeps resisting—" "I know. That's why I'm here. Mrs. Henderson is meeting with David Morrison this afternoon to turn over the security footage. By tonight you should be released and Sterling should be arrested, but there's something else you need to know." James looked around the visitation room again, then leaned closer. "Yesterday morning, after Sterling left, Mr. Thompson did something remarkable. He stood up from his wheelchair and walked across his bedroom. Not just a few steps, he walked the entire length of the room." Grace felt her heart leap. He walked, really walked, for about 5 minutes, until the realization of what he'd done hit him and the fear kicked in. "But Grace, your therapy worked. His legs are fine, his balance is fine. The only thing keeping him in that wheelchair now is psychological habit and the fear of what walking again means in terms of confronting Sterling." "Did you tell him about the security footage?" "Not yet. I wanted to wait until we had Sterling in custody. But Grace, there's something Mr. Thompson said that you need to hear." James pulled out a folded piece of paper. "He wrote this for you." Grace unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Michael's handwriting was shaky, but legible. "Grace, I don't remember everything from that night, but I remember enough. I remember Sterling standing over me, talking about moving money and eliminating problems. I remember the sound of you fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Most importantly, I remember why I'm falling in love with you. You came into my life asking for leftovers, and instead you gave me everything I'd lost: hope, courage, the will to stand up and face my problems. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me since my parents died. When you get out of jail, and you will get out, I'm going to walk to you, not wheel, not stumble, walk, because you taught me that love is worth standing up for. Yours always, Michael." Grace was crying openly now, not caring who saw her. The letter represented everything she'd hoped to accomplish and more. Not just physical healing, but emotional recovery, the kind of deep restoration that her father had dedicated his life to achieving. "There's one more thing," James said softly. "Sterling doesn't know about Mrs. Henderson's evidence yet. He thinks he's won, that he has complete control of the situation. Mr. Thompson wants to use that overconfidence against him." "What do you mean?" "He wants to confront Sterling directly, with the security footage and the police present. He wants to look Sterling in the eye and tell him that the theft stops now, that the intimidation stops now, that the lies stop now." James paused. "But he won't do it unless you're there with him. He says he needs you to see him stand up to the man who's been controlling his life through fear." Grace folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest like armor. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. David Morrison is coordinating with the district attorney's office. They want to catch Sterling in the act of trying to forge more documents, get him on tape making incriminating statements. It'll be dangerous. Cornered animals often lash out. But it's the best way to ensure he goes to prison for a long time instead of just getting a slap on the wrist." The plan was ambitious and risky, but Grace could see the wisdom in it. Sterling needed to be caught red-handed, his lies exposed publicly, his victims given the chance to face him from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. "James," Grace said as visiting time came to an end, "tell Michael I got his letter. Tell him I love him too and that I'll be there tomorrow when he stands up. Tell him that everything we've worked for comes down to the next 24 hours." As James left, Grace returned to her cell with renewed determination. Tomorrow would bring either justice or disaster, freedom or tragedy. But for the first time since her arrest, she felt like she was part of a team again, not just helping Michael heal, but fighting alongside him for a future neither of them could achieve alone. She spent the evening reviewing everything her father had taught her about confronting trauma, about the moment when victims become survivors by refusing to be victims anymore. Tomorrow, Michael would need every technique she'd learned, every ounce of courage she could provide. Grace fell asleep, clutching Michael's letter, dreaming not of the past they'd both lost, but of the future they were about to claim. The release papers were signed at 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning, just as the first light of dawn painted the Cumberland Hills gold. Grace walked out of Millbrook County Jail wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in 3 days earlier, but everything else had changed. David Morrison waited for her in the parking lot with a cup of coffee and a manila folder thick with evidence. "Mrs. Henderson's security footage is damning," he said without preamble as they drove toward Michael's house. "Sterling, the other 2 men, the syringe, the attempted break-in, it's all there. The district attorney is ready to move forward with charges of conspiracy, attempted fraud, assault, and breaking and entering." Grace sipped the coffee, feeling the caffeine chase away the last of her jail fog. "What about Michael? Is he ready for this?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "He's been preparing all night. James says he's been practicing walking, getting his strength back, but more importantly, he's been getting his courage back. Sterling made a mistake when he targeted you, Grace. It gave Michael something worth fighting for, besides just himself." They pulled through the gates of the Thompson estate just as Sheriff Bradley's patrol cars were taking positions around the property. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sterling would arrive for his usual morning visit, expecting to find Michael isolated and vulnerable. Instead, he would walk into a carefully orchestrated confrontation with video evidence, law enforcement, and most importantly, a man who was no longer afraid to stand up to him. Michael was waiting in his study, seated in his wheelchair but with a posture Grace had never seen before, alert, determined, ready for battle. When she walked through the door, he smiled with genuine joy for the first time since she'd known him. "Grace." He reached for her hands, pulling her close enough to whisper, "I missed you. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember what really happened that night. You were drugged, Michael. No one expects you to." "I remember enough." His voice carried a strength that matched his posture. "I remember Sterling standing over me, talking about moving assets and eliminating problems. I remember the sound of you fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. I remember why I fell in love with you." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of relief and joy rather than despair. "James said you've been walking every day since you've been gone. At first just a few steps, then across the room, then up and down the hallway. Yesterday I walked all the way to the front gate and back." Michael's hands tightened on hers. "Your therapy worked, Grace. Your father's techniques, your patience, your refusal to let me give up, it all worked." "I'm not the same man who couldn't stand up to Sterling 18 months ago." Through the window, they could see Sterling's black BMW approaching the house. Grace felt Michael's hands tremble slightly, but his grip remained firm. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Not just his physical recovery, but his emotional restoration, his return to being someone who faced problems instead of hiding from them. "Are you ready?" Grace asked. Michael released her hands and gripped the arms of his wheelchair. Then, slowly and deliberately, he stood up. Not the uncertain, tentative movement she'd seen in therapy, but a confident rise that spoke of rebuilt strength and rediscovered courage. "I've been ready for this conversation for 18 months, he said. I just needed to remember who I used to be. Sterling entered the study with his usual confident swagger, already talking before he'd fully crossed the threshold. "Michael, I've brought the final transfer documents for the offshore accounts. With the legal troubles your house guest has been causing, it's more important than ever that we protect your assets from—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Grace standing beside the desk, then noticed Michael on his feet beside his wheelchair. For a moment, Sterling's carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Grace, I thought you were in jail where you belong." "The charges were dropped," David Morrison said, stepping out from behind the door where he'd been waiting. "Funny thing about security cameras, Rob. They tend to record everything, including midnight break-ins and attempted pharmaceutical assault." Sterling's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate fury that made Grace step closer to Michael. She could see the brain injury Dr. Hayes had described manifesting in real time, Sterling's damaged neural pathways unable to process the complexity of his situation rationally. "I don't know what you think you have," Sterling said, his voice rising, "but Michael is clearly being manipulated by this woman. Look at him, standing up for the first time in over a year, putting on a show because she's got him convinced he's some kind of hero. It's pathetic." "The only thing that's pathetic," Michael said, his voice steady and strong, "is a man who steals from his best friend and then tries to destroy the woman who helped me heal from the damage you caused." Sterling's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Heal? You think this is healing? You're deluding yourself, Mike. You're still the same weak man who couldn't handle a simple business confrontation, who ran away into depression and self-pity instead of fighting for what was his." "You're right about one thing," Michael said, taking a step toward Sterling. "I was weak. I let fear control me, let the accident become an excuse to hide from everything difficult in my life. But Grace taught me something important. Sometimes healing means facing the people who hurt you instead of running away from them." Grace watched Sterling's face as Michael spoke, seeing the rage building behind his eyes. This was the dangerous moment Dr. Hayes had warned about, when Sterling's damaged brain would default to violence because it couldn't process any other response. "So here's what's going to happen," Michael continued. "You're going to return every penny you stole from the company. You're going to pay for the damage you've caused to Grace's property. And you're going to accept responsibility for your actions instead of trying to destroy innocent people to cover your crimes." Sterling's control finally snapped. "Innocent? She's a homeless con artist who saw an opportunity and took it. And you're too pathetic to see that she's just using you for your money." He lunged toward Grace, but Michael was faster. In one fluid movement, he stepped between them, his body remembering not just how to walk, but how to protect. Sterling collided with him, and both men went down, but Michael's fall was controlled, purposeful, a tackle rather than a collapse. Sheriff Bradley and his deputies rushed into the room as the two men struggled on the floor. Sterling was screaming about conspiracies and betrayal, his words increasingly incoherent as his mental state deteriorated. Michael held him until the officers could restrain him, then stood up slowly, brushing off his clothes with the calm dignity of a man who had finally stopped running from his problems. "Robert Sterling," Sheriff Bradley said, producing handcuffs, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, breaking and entering, assault, and attempted theft. You have the right to remain silent." As they led Sterling away, still ranting about injustice and manipulation, Grace moved to Michael's side. He put his arm around her, both of them watching through the window as Sterling's car was impounded, and his reign of terror finally ended. "So, what happens now?" Grace asked. Michael turned to face her, his eyes bright with possibilities neither of them had dared imagine a month ago. "Now we build something beautiful together. A life, a family, maybe even continue your father's work, helping other people heal from trauma." Grace thought about her father's journals, now recovered from the VA archives, about Michael's company, which could be rebuilt stronger than before, about the guest house, which would be reconstructed as something better, about two broken people who had found wholeness in each other. "I'd like that," she said. "All of it." Michael smiled and took her hand. "Then let's start walking toward it together." And for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt not just possible, but bright. Sometimes life delivers its most precious gifts through the most unlikely messengers. Michael and Grace's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from medicine bottles or therapy sessions. It comes from human connection, from someone brave enough to ask for help and compassionate enough to offer it. At 55, 60, or 68, we might feel like our best chapters are behind us, that physical limitations or emotional wounds define our remaining years. But Grace showed us that a woman with nothing but her father's wisdom and a generous heart could transform a millionaire's mansion into a place of healing. Michael discovered that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the courage to stand up for those we love. Their love story transcends age and circumstance because it's built on something timeless, the belief that broken people can heal each other when they choose vulnerability over pride, connection over isolation. In a world that often dismisses the wisdom and worth of older adults, Michael and Grace prove that our most meaningful transformations might still be waiting around the corner, disguised as someone asking for our leftovers. What unexpected person has brought healing into your life? Have you ever found that helping someone else helped heal your own wounds? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.